And we're going to take this needle out and we're going to examine. That's the first thing you want to do. That can be an area of trouble. And you want to make sure that your needle isn't bent. Oftentimes we spray without our fluid cap, and that's a good chance you're going to bump your needle tip. So do check your tip. I use a magnifying visor for that. Obviously a big one here. And by looking at that tip, I can tell, and it is very, very slightly bent to the side. So we're going to not only clean that tip, we're going to straighten it also. So that's the needle comes out. Also, I'm going to take this packing nut off. I'm going to remove the back of the trigger mechanism. And now pay attention as they come out. Don't get worried if you think you forgot where something was supposed to go. There's schematics on how to put these back together. Okay, now I'm going to take the tip apart. Now you'll have the end cap, and then you're going to have the larger cap behind that. And last but not least, you're going to have a very small fluid nozzle. Iwatas are one of the smallest nozzles that I know of, and they'll come with a little wrench. And if you loosen that, you'll take the fluid nozzle off. And that little, maybe the camera can get a close-up of this. That little fluid nozzle is the size of 3 grains of salt. And if you drop it or if you sneeze, it's gone. So we're going to wash all these parts, clean them up real nice, then we're going to reassemble. Just for safekeeping, I'm going to put them in a glass. If you're using lacquers, you're going to clean with lacquer paints. You're going to clean with lacquer thinner. Lacquer thinner is a good product to clean all of your moving parts. We're using Createx acrylics, so I'm going to clean with the 4013 thinner. There's also really hard to clean parts, 4008 Restorer, and that's a good product to clean with also. We'll use that. And you don't need a lot because all of these parts are pretty small. And I'm just going to drop them all in here so I don't lose them. Last but not least, your fluid nozzle. Now, the needle I'm just going to lay in here, and I like to clean that with steel wool. And you want your needle nice and polished. It's got to go through some packing material. It's got to slide through your fluid nozzle real nice and neat. You don't want any cake on dirt or grit or paint. And now that my needle is nice and clean, I'm going to take a little bit of Iwata lube. Comes like that. It's just a good all-round lubricant for your airbrush. And I just put a little on that needle. And that needle's really nice and clean right now. Okay, now I'm just going to take every one of these parts and treat them individually and clean them up and lubricate them. You can use, I like to use a paintbrush. a nice stiff paintbrush works really good for getting dried paint and grit and just paint residue off of these parts. I'm going to let that one dry just a little bit, and then we're going to oil that also. Now sometimes from day to day you can get by just spraying the appropriate thinner through your airbrush to clean it, but sooner or later it's probably going to take a real thorough cleaning like we're doing now. Even this spring, a lot of times your trigger just isn't performing like you want. It's not smooth. You want to get that spring nice and clean, all residue off of there. A clean airbrush is a happy artist. One part at a time, just keep plucking them out and cleaning them up. I am going to clean this paint receptacle on the top of my airbrush, and anytime we clean all these parts, we used to use a lot of Q-tips, and I thought I was doing a real service to my airbrush with Q-tips, and that cotton is a real bad thing to get in your airbrush nozzles. It can really make them quit spraying right away. Now some people in live last week asked about like one of the vibrator jewelry cleaners, and I used to do that. I didn't feel, and I probably had a cheap one, I didn't feel that it worked very well. I would put all the parts in, and then it's called ultrasonic, and you put a fluid in there, and it supposedly cleans jewelry is what the one I had, but it never did the job on my airbrush parts like I thought it should. Okay, one small little fluid nozzle in here, and we don't want to lose that. Now, that nozzle is so small, there's nothing that can go up the back of that nozzle except your needle. So if you wanted to make sure that there's nothing in your nozzle, you can slide your needle in here and just work that needle softly up and down. Now you will destroy your nozzle by forcing that needle in too tight. So if you put your needle too hard into your airbrush, you can wreck that nozzle, and that's an expensive replacement part. Okay, I've got everything cleaned up to what I think is much better than what it was. I'm going to oil all my parts with Iwata lube. And if you keep these all nice and oiled up, they will come apart much easier the next time. Okay, all the parts are ready to go. Now, we're going to spend just a couple minutes on the carcass of the airbrush here. Now, we used to use not only Q-tips, we would use a lot of pipe cleaners down the tube of our airbrush. That's another thing. Be careful of that cotton. And the wire brushes, a lot of these kits, these airbrush kits, come with wire brushes to clean your airbrush parts with, and they work good, and the small ones will go all the way down the tube, clean up any dried paint up in there. But do be careful because the wire brushes are held together. They're kind of a synthetic material, the brush material, but it's held together with a twisted wire, and you want to be careful because that twisted wire can harm your airbrush. We're going to make that airbrush look brand new. Now, a lot of these, doesn't really matter the brand, if you take care of them and keep the working parts, the parts that you use every day that controls your amount of paint coming out, like the needle and the tips, just by replacing those tips periodically, you can keep an older airbrush running for years and years and years. A lot of people think they need a new airbrush when really all they need is a few dollars worth of parts. Okay, now we're going to put it back together. I'm going to start with my little nozzle before I lose it. If you drop that on the floor, you're not going to find it. Now, be careful. I twisted one of these off once. Be careful tightening it down. Just a soft tighten on the nozzle. Like that. Okay, the next part that I'm going to put on, I'll go ahead and put my cap on here. Finger tighten. I don't use tools or pliers to take any of these apart, just finger tighten. Now the end cap is on. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my trigger down. This can be a little confusing for you sometimes. The trigger will set down in a little saddle, and it's spring loaded. And you'll know when you're there, when the trigger is very springy. Once the trigger is in place, there's names for all these, and I'm sorry, I don't know them all. That goes against the trigger, then goes the spring. The next part, keep an eye on your parts. If you're going to have parts left over, it's not going to work. Now I have to keep my finger on that trigger because that trigger will want to fall out, because what holds the trigger in is the needle. I'm going to screw that all the way in tight. My trigger can function all the way back. Now my needle's going to go through. Gently, gently, gently push your needle in. Don't force it in. This little nut holds the needle. Now the trigger is in place now. Works good. Last part is the barrel. And we should be good to go again. Now that's about as thoroughly as we clean an airbrush. Do check those parts, check your nozzle and your needle. With a magnifying visor, you'll be able to see splits and chips in your nozzle. If that little tiny nozzle has any kind of a damage on it, like a crack or a little flared out tip, it's not going to spray like you want it to spray. So check that with the magnifying visor. Check for any bends in the needle. Sharpen Air is a great tool to straighten your needles. If you ever need to straighten your needles, it'll make them look like brand new and save you a lot of money in the process. Most of the airbrushes are similar. The Pache double actions are very similar to this. Badgers, they all work alike. The parts are different shaped, but they all kind of function very similar. Hope that helps you. Thanks.